The main difference between our country and Europe is this. Our life is turned inward, Europe's outward. We judge of good and evil, etc., from the point of motive. Europe judges it on the basis of action done. And this is the first sentence of an article written in Bengali by Sri Aurobindo and called East and West. So he continues saying, knowing God as one who dwells within and who knows all that passes in our minds, we seek Him in the soul. Europe looks upon Him as the King of the world and seeks and worships Him in the world outside. So this is this division that we make in the West between ourselves and God. Mother said, it's extremely difficult for the Western mind to comprehend vividly and concretely that all is the divine. It is so impregnated with the Christian spirit, with the idea of a creator, the creation on one side, God on the other. Sri Aurobindo continues in his article, the heaven of Europe is in the material world. Worldly riches, beauty, luxury are welcome and to be sought after. If they imagine any other heaven, that too is a reflection of these riches, beauty and luxury. You have the example in Christian religion with the heaven described with jeweled walls and pearly gates and streets of gold. Their God, says Sri Aurobindo, the Christian God, is akin to our Indra, who rules his world empire, sitting like an earthly monarch on a bejeweled throne, swollen by the hymns and prayers of 1,000 flatterers. Our Shiva, he continues, is the supreme among gods. Yet he is but a beggar, out of his senses, uncaring and forgetful. Our Krishna is a youth, fond of laughter, fun and love. It is in his nature to be playful. The God of Europe never laughs or plays, since His Majesty is hurt by these activities. His Godhead suffers. The extrovert attitude is at the back of it. Signs of wealth are, for them, the Europeans, the support of splendor. They cannot see a thing unless they see the sign. They have no divine, no subtle vision. Everything is material. Our Shiva, he says, he is a beggar. But to the spiritual seeker, he easily gives away all the wealth and wisdom of the three worlds. He is generous to a fault, but the wisdom beyond the reach of the wise is his inborn possession. Our loving, gay Krishna is the hero of the Kurukshetra, father of the worlds, friend and companion of the universe. India's immense knowledge and subtle vision, unfettered divine vision, pierces through the material veils and brings out the inner attitude, the true truth, the inner and subtle principles. The same order is observed about good and evil. We look at the inner attitude. There may lurk holy feelings behind an activity that we condemn. Just as behind the outwardly good and sanctimonious conduct, may lie hidden the self-seeking of a scoundrel. Good and evil, joy and sorrow are subjective factors. The outer activity is but a veil. And he gives the example of the renunciant, the sannyasi. The sannyasi who behaves like a thing inert in the hands of nature, which is called jadavat in India, or behave like mad, God-possessed frenzy, careless of itself and the world, unmatavat, or maniac or demoniac, pisachavat, who behaves as beyond rules and conventions, duty or otherwise, beyond good and evil. Such a one, who has risen above laws, we call the Supreme Person. The Western intellect is unable to accept such a principle. He who behaves as inert, it treats him as inert. He who behaves as if he's mad, it treats him as off his head. He who behaves like a fiend, a demon, it treats him as a disgusting, lawless devil. For it has no subtle vision and is unable to look at the inner attitude or truth. Morality is for the Western mind mostly a thing of outward conduct. But conduct for the Indian mind is only one means of expression and sign of a soul state. In Hinduism, for example, says Sri Aurobindo, they insist strongly, almost too strongly, he says, on thou shouldst not kill, but insists more firmly on the injunction, thou shalt not hate, thou shalt not yield to greed, anger, or malice, for these are the roots of killing. Mother says, it is the spirit and the consciousness from which it is done that makes an action yogic or un-yogic, not yogic. It is not the action itself. It is not what you do, but the spirit in which you do it that is important. And all depends on the choice of the force that you allow to make use of you as its instrument. You have to carefully observe the initiating impulses of your movements and actions and discriminate between those that come from the truth and those that come from the falsehood. The reason, says Sri Aurobindo, is chiefly concerned with what it best understands: the apparent process, the machinery, the outward act. By these, it judges the morality of the action and the morality of the doer. But the developed ethical being knows instinctively that it is an inner something which it seeks. This is always this dichotomy between the inner and the outer, the essence and the form. Sri Aurobindo explains. He says, there is a difference between the essence of a thing, which is always the same, and its formations and developments, which vary. There is, for instance, the essence of gold, and there are the many forms which gold can take. So we have on one hand the essence, the spirit, the substance, and on the other we have the form, the shape, the expression, the outward appearance that it is taking. So it's a very important distinction on which Sri Aurobindo insists a lot. It is the distinctions which he makes between God and nature. For the world, he says, and its ways are forms of one truth which appears in this material world in ever new bodies and constantly varied apparel. The inward eternal taking the joy of outward mutability. The inward eternal, God, is clothing himself in all the forms and the shapes of the manifestation. The manifestation is its external body. God is the soul. So this difference between the inner and the outer is very crucial. And Sri Aurobindo explains that the Western mind is always busy with the outer, with the outward form, while the East is more concerned with the essence, with the spirit, with the inner meaning of things. And here is an interesting test that illustrates that difference.
This is a ducks. Ducks.
Ducks, yeah.
Okay. Which one is the ducks?
That's another duck. Because it's round like this one.
I would say that one.
Why?
Why? Because it's the same, similar shape. The colour doesn't matter.
Which one is the ducks?
That one.
Why?
Same shape.
Which one is the ducks?
That one,
Why?
because it's got that one's got a curve like that, and that one's got two circles there, and this is both the same, but they're different colour.
얘야. 이유는요? 그냥 비슷하게 된 걸로 이루어져 있으니까.
이거요.
왜요?
질감이 비슷하니까요.
なんで？
だって同じだから木
そっか。
木でしょ木でしょ、だから
こっち。
撮ってください。
はい。
その理由は何ですか？
素材が一緒だから。素材というか木の木目とか。
我觉得这个是，
为什么？
因为它俩的虽然形状不同，但是形状可以塑造、可以改，而质地它俩是一样的，材料是一样。
The Westerner thinks of shape. That's what makes him choose the other cylinder, even though it is made of a different material. The Asian puts the emphasis on an object's essence more than its shape. That's why he will tend to pair the objects based on their substance, in this case, wood. The Western mind, says Sri Aurobindo, is arrested and attracted by the form, lingers on it, and cannot get away from its charm. It might almost be said that for this mind, form creates the spirit. The spirit depends for its existence on the form. And we have an example of this in religion. In the Christian religion, for instance, the idea that the soul, the self, is created with the physical body. So even the religious, they believe that the soul was born in the body. God first making the body, then breathing the soul into it. So we have this prevalence, this importance that is given to the physical body, and the soul comes only afterwards. We see another example of this in politics. The Occidentals are busy with the outward forms and means of democracy, says Sri Aurobindo. But, he insists, the external form is only for the purpose of expressing the inner attitude. It is this attitude that shapes the form. The Occidentals are so attached to the forms that they are unable to notice that in their external expressions, the inner attitude and reverence are languishing. The Indian attitude to the matter is at the opposite pole to this view. For the Indian mind, form does not exist except as a creation of the spirit and draws all its meaning and value from the spirit. We see an example in art. The Indian painter or other artist does not imitate the external world. His aim is to go beyond the outward scene and appearance and express the inner feeling and truth. The external shape is only a robe, a disguise of the inner truth. Indian painters deliberately modified the outer form in order to make it more suitable for expressing the inner truth. The West is busy with the false external perception. They are devotees of the shadow. The East seeks the inner truth. We are devotees of the eternal. The West worships the body. We worship the soul. The West is in love with name and form. We can never be satisfied unless we get to the eternal object. This difference is evident everywhere, as in religion, philosophy, and literature, so in painting and architecture. When it comes to the psychology of the individual being, we also see stark contrasts between the East and the West. The Western mind lays an enormous stress upon force of personality, upon the individual will, upon the apparent man, and the desires and demands of his nature. This is the life power in us, the vitalistic, the dynamic nature. Its whole principle and aim is to be, to assert its existence, to increase, to expand, to possess, and to enjoy. Its native terms are growth of being, pleasure, and power. The flowering of the mental and vital ego is the West's cultural ideal. Be yourself, express yourself, be different, be original, be unique. But here, in India, is an opposing stress on a high growth towards impersonality, on the widening of the individual into the universal will, on an increasing or breaking beyond the apparent man and his limits. The ego is regarded as the chief obstacle to the soul's perfection. Its place is proposed to be taken by something inward, abstract, transcendental, absolutely real. This is the ideal in India, not about your individualistic greatness. It's about becoming something else. It's about becoming divine. The Western temperament is rajasic, kinetic, pragmatic, active. Thought, for it, turns always to action and has little value except for the sake of action, or else for a fine satisfaction of the mind's play and vigor. But in India, the type proposed for admiration is the self-possessed, sattvic man, for whom calm thoughts, spiritual knowledge, and the inner life are the things of the greatest importance, and action is chiefly of consequence, not for its own sake, not for its rewards and fruits, but for its effects on the growth of the inner nature. The European is essentially scientific, artistic, and commercial. The Asiatic is essentially a moralist, pietist, and philosopher. And of course, the distinction is not rigid or absolute. There is much that is Asiatic in a number of Europeans, and there is much that is European in a numbers of Asiatics. But, says Sri Aurobindo, the fundamental divergence in speculative habits is very noticeable. Also, Mother insists on that. She says, I have met some born in Europe who were evidently Indians. I have met others born in Indian bodies who were evidently Europeans. But still the great lines remain. We see that the people of Europe have carried the material life to its farthest expression, while the life of the Hindu has been mostly inward. Because of this mastery over matter, the Westerners have a sense of superiority when they come to India. They all have that, all of them. The arrogance of the European. Oh, because the European is indeed used to dealing with matter. So he has a certain authority over matter. That's true. For instance, they are much more orderly. I'm talking in a general way. There are exceptions everywhere. They have a certain mastery over matter that doesn't exist here in India. And because of that, they feel so superior that it's disgusting. I find this in all those who come. And I must admit, I let them flounder about for some years until they suddenly realize that with all their superiority, they are inferior. Then we can start getting along with each other. Inferior? In fact, Sri Aurobindo mentioned openly the Indian superiority on several occasions in his writings. One of them was after he spent 1 year in the Alipore jail. He wrote an article in Bengali titled Prison and Freedom, in which he says, thanks to my experience of these 12 months that he spent in jail, I have been able to return to the world of action with tenfold hope, with a fixed notion about Indian superiority, with redoubled respect for human character, the future progress and well-being of the motherland and the human race. Then Sri Aurobindo describes several prisoners, and I will read one of them for you. The first one he describes: a cowherd by profession, uneducated, without anything to do with reading or writing. His only support was his faith in God and patience, worthy of an Aryan, and other noble qualities. Faced with this old man's attitude towards life, my pride of learning and forbearance was completely shattered. There was a serene and simple friendliness written in the old man's eyes. His talk was always full of amiability and friendliness. At times he would speak of his sufferings, even though he was innocent of the charges, and speak of his wife and children. He even wondered where God would bring him release so that he could meet them. But never did I find him depressed or restless. Waiting for God's grace, he spent his days quietly doing his duties in the prison. All his efforts and thoughts were not concerned about himself, but about the well-being of others. His sense of kindness and sympathy for the sorrowing frequently came out in his speech. Serving others was the law of his being. The noble qualities were further set off by his humility. His kindly attention and humble service and respect seemed to be much greater, especially for the innocent and miserable ones. Yet on his face and in his conduct, there glowed a natural serene gravity and majesty. He had a great love for the country too. I shall always remember the serene visage of this old convict, full of kindness and generosity. Even in these days of decline among the Indian peasantry, whom we describe as uneducated, small people, may be found such representatives of the Indian race. India's future is hopeful only because of this. The educated youth and the unlettered peasantry, the future of India lies with these two classes. The future Aryan race will be a blend of the two. Then he describes these educated youth that he speaks about. There were some of them who were also in the hellish jail in which he was. He describes their qualities and how he never saw them angry or complaining or restless or depressed. They had been able to reject the supremacy of external joys and sorrows and succeeded in preserving the freedom of their inner life. But when Sri Aurobindo speaks about educated youth, he does not mean Western education. They were devoid of the glory of modern education, a knowledge of Western languages, and familiarity with Western learning. The mother tongue was their only stay. But among the English-educated group, I have found few men of comparable caliber. The virtues of the national character came out even among the real offenders, the thieves, the robbers, the murderers. We received from all and sundry good behavior and helpfulness. Rather, it was among those spoiled by modern education that these qualities seemed to be lacking. He actually speaks elsewhere about Western education, and he calls it the poison of Western education. When the poison of Western education was first poured into our veins. Modern education, he says, may have many virtues to recommend itself, but civility and selfless service form no part of these. The kindness and sympathy that are such valuable elements of an Aryan education. I found that even among the thieves and the robbers, those who vaunt about Western culture. I would like to ask them, is this self-control, charity, generosity, gratitude, godly love for others to be found among the lower order of criminals, the thieves and robbers of England? In fact, in a similar situation, they would go down with depressive anger and sorrow, or because of the contagion of companions, adopt their cruelty and low ways, or else, because of the extreme pressure of weakness, lose strength and reasoning power, so that what survives is only a remnant of humanity. The Indian mind when in seclusion, though there be external suffering, turns through an eternal attraction to God. This is what happened with us too. A current, I do not know from where, just swept us all. Even people who had never taken God's name learned to practice some spiritual discipline, and realizing the grace of the most gracious became steeped in joy. In fact, says Sri Aurobindo, Europe is the land of enjoyment, India of sacrifice. The sacrifice of desire and personal, narrow self-interest for the sake of God. The sacrifice of the lower for the sake of the higher. The sacrifice of the ego for the sake of the soul. The capacity to sacrifice outward enjoyment for the sake of inner freedom. The teaching in India is of long standing that all must be turned towards the divine, and everything else either sacrificed or changed into a subordinate and ancillary movement, or made by sublimation a first step only towards the seeking for the divine. To acquire, by ignoring the outward joys and sorrows, the inner freedom is possible only for the Indian. The Indian alone is capable of undertaking activity in a spirit of non-attachment, says Sri Aurobindo. And of course here he speaks about the general public, not about individual beings. There are always exceptions, and Sri Aurobindo had several Western disciples who were totally able to undertake his yoga. But in a general way, the Indian is more equipped for doing this. The Gita, he continues in his article, describes two kinds of creatures, Deva and Asura. Men, at least men above a certain level, fall very largely into two classes. Those who have a dominant force of sattvic nature, turned towards knowledge, self-control, beneficence, perfection, and those who have a dominant force of rajasic nature, turned towards egoistic greatness, satisfaction of desire, the indulgence of their own strong will and personality, which they seek to impose on the world, not for the service of man or God, but for their own pride, glory, and pleasure. These are the human representatives of the Devas and Asuras, the gods and the titans. The Indian is intrinsically of the Deva kind, the Western of the Asura. But in this age of deep darkness, because of the disappearance of Aryan education, due to the predominance of inertia, in our national decline, we are acquiring the inferior qualities of the Asura, while the Westerners, because of their national progress and the evolution of manhood, are acquiring the qualities of the Deva. But in spite of this, in their Deva qualities, something of the Asura, and in our Asuric qualities, something of the Deva, can be imperfectly glimpsed. Among them, the Westerners, those who are the cream, even they cannot wholly get rid of the Asuric qualities. When one compares the inferior specimens of both cultures, the truth comes out quite strikingly. The ordinary materialized souls, the external minds, are the majority in India as everywhere. But at least the people of India, even the ignorant masses, have this distinction that they are, by centuries of training, nearer to the inner realities, are divided from them by a less thick veil of the universal ignorance, and are more easily led back to a vital glimpse of God and Spirit, self and eternity, than the mass of men, or even the cultured elite anywhere else. And Mother confirms. She says, a simple and ignorant peasant here is, in his heart, closer to the divine than the intellectuals of Europe. And she adds, all those who want to become Aurovillians must know this and behave accordingly. Otherwise, they are unworthy of being Aurovillians. She wrote this message in 1972, after she received a report of an attitude of superiority of some Westerners towards the Indians. This Western arrogance and sense of superiority, which we already mentioned before, is also connected to their intellectual development, their mental ego. In the West, the intellectual development has prevailed over the spiritual development and the contact with higher regions, while in India, the inner knowledge has remained more developed than the intellectual field. So we could say, the West expresses more than it really knows. India knows more than it really can express. In fact, the intellect has never been given the first rank in India, even by the metaphysical thinkers, when it comes to discover the truth. The first rank, says Sri Aurobindo, has always been given to spiritual intuition and illumination and spiritual experience. Additionally, each philosophy in India has armed itself with a practical way of reaching to the supreme state of consciousness, so that even when one begins with thought, the aim is to arrive at a consciousness beyond mental thinking. In the West, it was just the opposite that came to pass. Thought, intellect, the logical reason, came to be regarded more and more as the highest means and even the highest end. In philosophy, thought is the be-all and the end-all. It is by intellectual thinking and speculation that the truth is to be discovered. Western thought has sought after a theory of things, not after realization. It became intellectual speculation only, without any practical ways and means for the attainment of the truth by spiritual experiment, spiritual discovery, a spiritual transformation. And that is the reason why you have more and more seekers who turn to the East for answers and for guidance. The spiritual way, the road that leads beyond the intellectual levels, the passage from the outer being to the inmost self, has been lost by the over-intellectuality of the mind of Europe. England, with her practical intelligence, France, with her clear logical brain, Germany, with her speculative genius, Russia, with her emotional force, America, with her commercial energy, have done what they could for human development, but each has reached the limit of her peculiar capacity. Something is wanting, which Europe cannot supply. So to summarize, we see that two things especially distinguish the normal European mind: the cult of reason and the cult of life. So the mental ego and the vital ego. And then the two colossal idols, physical science and industrialism. Christianity failed to spiritualize Europe because it ran counter to these two master instincts. It denied the supremacy of the reason and put its anathema on a satisfied or strenuous fullness of life. The Indian mind and temperament is less exclusively intellectual and vital, and more intuitively synthetic and flexible than that of the Occidental peoples. The closer meeting of these two halves of the mind of humanity may set up a more powerful connection between the two poles of our being. The two continents, the East and the West, Europe and India, are two sides of the integral orb of humanity. And until they meet and fuse, each must move by the law of its being, its own proper dharma. There is a need of divergent lines of advance until we can raise our heads into that infinity of the spirit, in which there is a light broad enough to draw together and reconcile all highest ways of thinking, feeling, and living.